Okay, this morning I'm going to look at bitterness. Bitterness. As I studied this topic, I realized that of all the daily sins we have, this is one of those ones that if we pay attention to it, this is literally an everyday sin for all of us. And our bitterness is usually against somebody. We don't generally have bitterness against this plant or the grass or the trees. It's usually against people. And I saw a saying that really defines what bitterness is, really is. Being bitter is like drinking poison and expecting the one who hurt you to die. That's what bitterness is. It is our anger, disappointment, resentment at other people. So today's talk is on the gall of bitterness. I'd like to look at a definition of bitterness. Bitterness in Hebrew is mera, and the first real place that we see that and what I think we all associate it with is as the Israelites left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and they finally came to water at this place called Mara, and the water was bitter. And they cried before the Lord. Moses went to the Lord, and he had them put a tree in the water, and it sweetened the water up, and they were able to drink. But the water originally was just bitter water. What do we think of when we think of bitterness? I was trying to think of all these different things I thought about when I was a kid, and I see little plants, and I pick up a dandelion and bite the stem, and it's bitter. I thought a lot about what we're entertained by nowadays, giving our little kid a lemon or a lime and watching them bite into it. Just, that's bitter, you know. Our modern word bitter comes from an old English word, bitterly. What is bitterness? Bitterness is used in the Bible in different variations in 81 different verses. And the Oxford Languages Dictionary defines bitterness as anger, disappointment, it being treated unfairly, and a close relative word would be resentment. Is bitterness sin? As we look in 1 Samuel 1, we look at Hannah, a woman who wanted a son, desperately wanted a son. And 1 Samuel 1:10 says, and she was in bitterness of soul. In and of itself, bitterness is not a sin. It's what we do with bitterness that makes it a sin. When held onto and cultivated, it springs forth and grows into something horribly sinful. Something that Peter told Simon in Acts 8 was the gall of bitterness. When I lived in Georgia years ago, I saw this plant on the side of the highways, and I asked somebody about it. I was like, wow, what is that plant? It's just covering everything. He goes, years ago, the state thought it would be nice. It was a decorative growing vine that would just cover stuff and be nice and cool. And he said, so they imported it from Japan. And this plant started growing. And as it grew, they realized something about this plant. You couldn't stop it. You literally could not stop it unless you took it out by the roots. And even then, if you did not get every bit of root, literally, if you could miss a piece of root, the next day there would be a shoot coming out of the ground. It grew so fast. And in our lives, it's the same way. If we don't get every root of that bitterness out of our life, it just keeps growing and growing and growing. How many of us deal with bitterness on a daily basis? All of us, right? For those of you that didn't raise your hand, I'm sure we will be preaching a message later on lying. So we have all dealt with bitterness in our lives at some point, and if we're honest, it is something that we deal with daily. Just an example of that, last night I was deep in the depths of studying, going through my notes, refining, and getting this message straightened out, and I said I have to have a break. So I headed down the road to Smoothie King to get a little bit of refreshment, and as I headed back home and came to an intersection, the light turned green and the car in front of me just slowly eased into the intersection, very slowly. What was I doing? As I was rehearsing my text, rehashing my notes, I found myself haranguing this lady and just, come on, what are you doing? Get out of my way, let's go. I was in the right lane, I needed to be in the left lane as I crossed the bridge. Finally, as she gets ahead and I zip past her and look over, this lady is looking at me and going, My whole message flashed before my eyes. All my notes, all my studies, everything that I'd been looking at, and here I am looking at bitterness and how it affects our daily lives. And there, in just that one little moment, it reared its ugly head. So we struggle with bitterness every single day. Where does bitterness enter our lives? One way, and I think it's the number one way bitterness enters our lives, is through envy. I want to look at Luke 15. In Luke 15, we read the story of the prodigal son, and it's a story of a father's enduring love as he finally welcomes that prodigal son home. But what I want to look here at is a younger brother. So let's go to Luke 15, and I'm just going to look at a little section. Verse 25 says, "Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came home and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And the servant said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound." So good so far, right? Let's keep reading. "And he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out and entreated him. And he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgress I at any time." Neither transgressed I at any time. I'm sinless. Come on, I'm the good son here. "Neither I transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid that I might make merry with my friends." Let's stop there for a minute. I think you see the point, but in case you don't see it, let's focus a bit more. Here's a wealthy man. He's got two sons. His younger son comes to him and says, give me my inheritance. So this man gives him half of his assets. And the son leaves, disappears, does his own thing. You know, the older brother's got to be a little upset. He's got to be frustrated. He just took half of everything and left. Okay. Look at his words again to his dad. "I've done everything for you. I've never done anything wrong. But," and here's the point, "but you never gave me a kid that I might party with my friends." A little paraphrase there, but that's the point of it. What do we see there? Envy. Envy for his brother. I don't know how long the younger brother was gone. I don't know how long he was in a far land. It could have been 6 months. It could have been years. But for years, that older brother has held that in his heart. And it's interesting that he doesn't seem that he's held it in his heart that little brother took a lot of money and a lot of stuff. It seems that he held in his heart that his little brother got something that he didn't get. Because that's his first words. "I've done all this. I've been so good. And you gave him all this, and you gave him a party, and you didn't give it to me." Now, if Dad loved his kids so much that he was willing to give the younger son half of everything, don't you think that he probably loved him enough to give the older son a party? If the older son had asked, he probably would have got a party. "Dad, give me the fatted calf. Let me have a party with my friends." It would have happened. But he held on to that envy, and he let it just destroy him, just let it rot him. So what are some other things that we look at in other people that we can find to be envious of them about? Maybe it's business acumen. Maybe it's financial security, good looks, people skills, athleticism. My brother-in-law, David, has always been good at sports. I've always wanted to be good at sports. I told my parents I wanted to play ball. They said, "We can't afford it." And I said, "Okay." David, I'm sure his parents said, "We can't afford it." But what was David doing? David was 8, 9 years old, out mowing lawns, dragging a mower around the neighborhood, mowing lawns, making money, making it work. Now, both of us had something to be envious about. Me, I probably held on to my envy. David worked at it, made it happen. In anything you can find to envy another person, whether it's finances, looks, athleticism, it's your own power to strive to achieve, and envy and bitterness will kill that effort. In all these things, if we're not in constant fellowship with God, bitterness can creep in and beset us. Another root cause of bitterness is anger. In Genesis 4, we look at the story of Cain and Abel and their sacrifices. In Genesis 4, 3 through 7, God told that Cain, unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. What does that mean? I think, I'm not totally sure on this text, but I think plainly speaking, it means that sin desires mastery over us, and we will use it to our advantage. And he does. Genesis 4, 8, and 9, let's look at 3 through 7 first. In the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect to Abel and his offering. But to Cain and his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. So there's that bitterness in the form of anger. Genesis 4, 8, and 9. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? He said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? I want you guys to do something real quick. I want everybody to close their eyes. Everybody's got a sibling. I know we've all got a sibling. Now, you might have a sibling that you've had struggles with. Now, just picture that sibling. Picture your lives together, growing up together, playing games together, having fun together, no matter what you're doing together. Now imagine killing your sibling for something so simple as a sacrifice. What an incredible amount of hatred. You can all open your eyes. What an incredible amount of hatred and bitterness in somebody's heart that they would actually kill their brother. Yet, for lack of a sacrifice, that's what Cain did. How does bitterness start? Where does it come from? Most of the time, bitterness comes from feeling overlooked, hurt, or mistreated. We hold on to that envy, that anger, that resentment. And how do we hold on to it? One way we hold on to it is we replay the offense. We think about what happened over and over again in our mind. And as we dwell on the offense, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. In our mind, any part of it that we have played gets smaller and smaller. Does this happen to us? Does it happen to you? I know it happens to me. A few weeks ago, I did not move a trailer at work before I left to go home. Trucks were busy, things were happening. Get in the morning and went home. My boss sent me a text later basically rebuking me for not getting the trailer moved and getting things ready for in the morning. What did I do? I dwelt on that text all night long. I thought about it. I thought about it, and I thought about it. And in the morning, when my boss came up to me and started talking, I blew up. There's that bitterness rearing its ugly head. Was my boss wrong to text me? Was I right to feel that I had an issue with him? Neither was the issue. The issue is that I held on to that text in my mind and I kept reliving what I perceived it to mean, and without even realizing it, I built up bitterness for my boss. And when it came out at my boss, it not only came out to him, it came out to his boss and the company altogether. So we see that reliving hurt, imagined or real, just grows that bitterness in our heart. Another way we hold on to that anger and resentment is by retelling our hurts. Telling others about our hurts, real or perceived, just helps them grow in our own eyes. In a smaller sense, Adam did exactly this, and so did Eve. In Genesis 3:11, God asked Adam, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou should not eat? Here Adam comes to a fork in the road. What's the right way? You're right, God. I sinned. I was wrong. But what ways does Adam choose? The first words out of his mouth. The woman that you gave me. And I don't think that that is a real big display of bitterness, but you can hear the bitterness in his voice. The woman that you gave me made me eat, gave it to me, and I ate. Adam, man up. But Eve's no better. What did Eve say? The serpent beguiled me. Same thing. Eve could have said, God, I was wrong. I literally started it. But you know what? Eve coined a phrase that we still use today. The devil made me do it. And in that she showed just a little, maybe, bitterness. How else do we hold on to that anger and resentment? We look for other reasons to dislike the person. And in all things, when we find that we have bitterness, we find ourselves looking at that person and finding other areas that they're wrong in our eyes. Let's look at Saul. King Saul of Israel. What did the Bible say about him? He was a tall man. He was a big man. He was an imposing man. David was just a little kid looking after sheep. But God anointed him to be the next king of Israel, and I think that's what started it. But what did David do? David killed Goliath. This is something nobody in the kingdom seemed to be able to do. Even Saul the king didn't seem to be able to get this done. But David, this kid, shows up and does it. Maybe it was that. Maybe it could have been coming back from battle with David and hearing the people singing. Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his 10,000s. Can you imagine if you built up bitterness in your heart for somebody and you hear that? He's done good. He's done better. That's pretty rough. The last way to hold on to that anger and resentment is wishing for retribution. Does this happen to me? I wish it would happen to him. What would he think if it happened to him? And I want to look at one of the last people that you guys would think, that any of us would think, to look at, to talk about bitterness in somebody's life and holding on to that bitterness and wanting retribution. And that's Joseph. Joseph was disliked by his brothers. He was thrown in a pit. Somebody found him, sold him into slavery. He became the captain of Potiphar's house, where he was accused of attempted rape and thrown into prison yet again. He became the second most powerful man in Egypt, probably in the world. And while he did treat his brothers graciously, bitterness did rear its ugly head when his brothers came to buy corn. I said, well, wait a minute, how's that? He was actually pretty gracious to them. Genesis 42:8 says, and Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew him not. Let's look at Genesis 42, verse 9. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them, and said unto them, you're spies to see the nakedness of this land if you come. You go down in the passage, you're spies, you're spies, you're spies. And then he says, if you be true men, let one of your brothers be bound and stay here in prison, and the rest of you go to your father. Bring your younger brother. I want to see your younger brother, because I think you're spies. And then when he lets them go, what does he do? Fills their bags with corn, puts their money back in the bags, and sends them on their way. So they go home. Family is family. They start running out of corn. Father says, go get us more corn. Well, we can't, not unless we bring Benjamin. Father says, I'm going to die if anything happens to Benjamin. So Judah says, it's on my head. If anything happens, it's on me. We have to do it. So they bring Benjamin. They come back. They're reunited with Simon, their brother, and they have dinner with Joseph. Things go on. They head back home. Joseph puts her money back in their sacks, puts his silver cup in Benjamin's sack, sends them home, and then when they're on their way, he sends his men and brings them back. One of you's got my cup. I should kill whoever has it, or I'm going to make him a slave, or he can serve in my house. You know, as I've read this story over the years, I never really thought about it, but there had to have been a lot of bitterness built up in Joseph's life. That he would, over the course of, I don't know, months, would torture these guys with wondering whether they're going to end up in jail what's going to happen to him? This guy is really sticking it to him. I mean, you got to think about it. This is 7 years of famine, or 7 years of good, plenty, and we're into the famine. How many years before that he spent in jail in Egypt, in Potiphar's house? 12 years, 14 years. It's been since he's seen his brothers, and what does he do? He makes them suffer. What about it? What is about that long-standing bitterness in our lives? His pastor is talking to one of his deacons. He goes, "Why is it the congregation that is still bitter about a 42-year-old misunderstanding can't remember last week's sermon?" Do we carry the bitterness more than we carry the remembrance of what we heard a few weeks ago? Whenever something happens to a person that makes them sad, disappointed, or angry, that root can grow into a tree and take over a person's whole life, just like that kudzu. Anger and envy lead to bitterness. Proverbs 14:30 says, "A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot." This is because envy has a way of spiraling your heart into a pit of bitterness like the spread of toxic spores. It can lead to other sins like discontent, ungratefulness, judgment, malice, and slander. Leads me to 7 things that we can do to break the chains of bitterness in our lives. How do you fight that bitterness? How do you, as we struggle with it on our own, we need to realize that we need to put Christ first. We need to have God in our lives, and we need to use different tools that we've been given to fight that bitterness in our life. First way is thanksgiving. 1 Timothy 2:1 says, "Giving of thanks be made for all men." Ephesians 5:20 says, "Giving thanks always for all things unto God." Hebrews 13:15 says, "By him therefore let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually, that is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name." How many of you think that if you draw close to God and you are continually thanking God, that you can continue to harbor bitterness in your heart for somebody else? It's almost impossible. Try praying and being bitter at the same time. God's sitting there going, "I'm not listening." Get that bitterness out of your heart. Be thankful. Second thing we can do to battle bitterness is be better, not bitter. In Colossians 3, "Since any of you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God." Although Joseph struggled with what his brothers dealt him, ultimately his heart was towards God, and he truly could look past his brothers' sins against him. In Genesis 15:19 and 20, he said, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." So when that bitterness is in our life, do we be bitter or do we be better? C.S. Lewis said, "Begin," and this is a hard one. I had to read this like 3 times to get it. "Begin by attending to everything which may show that the other man was not so much to blame as we thought." 1 John 4:20 says, "Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar." There's a third way to fight bitterness is to stop worry where it stands. This guy I don't know, Nicky Koziar, said, "Satan knows that bitterness is very effective with believers, and he will do what he can to keep that cycle going in our lives." We will always have the choice, stop the cycle or continue the cycle. Job 5:2 says, "For wrath killeth the foolish man, and envy slayeth the silly one." Rick Warren said, "When we give in to resentment, we act in self-destructive ways and hurt ourselves much more than those we're holding grudges against. Another way of breaking the chain of bitterness is to seek the truth. Healthy relationships are rooted in honesty. You know, many times in my life with good friends of mine, I have felt like it was safer just to not tell them everything. And what did that do? When I knew they were right and I was wrong, it created bitterness in my heart. And I resented them. Honesty, the best bet. The daily pursuit of our Father keeps bitterness and resentment at bay. Though uncomfortable to communicate with our offenders, praying into and through necessary conversations brings healing and peace. Honesty, the best method. Philippians 4:8, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report. If there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things, and the God of peace shall be with you. Can the God of peace be with you if you're bitter? Number 5, how do we break the chains of bitterness? Confession. And this is maybe should be at the top of the list. Confession. Proverbs 28:13 says, whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. We're all prone to wander, and we're all born into sin. True healing will not finally come from identifying causes or assigning guilt, but from trusting God. When God freed his people from the Egyptians, they still found plenty to complain about. When Peter saw the soldiers coming to take Jesus, he cut off an ear. As humans, we default to reactionary status. The only way to real freedom from bitterness is by God's forgiveness. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins, especially our bitterness, and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. 1 John 1:9. Maybe what we went through wasn't our fault, but our reaction bids confession. Number 6, don't try to change people. John Piper said, we often feel sinned against when the words or behavior had no sinful intention. Behind them all, when they had no sinful intention behind them all, and if we tried to forgive such a behavior, it would be offensive because the other person doesn't even feel that he or she sinned against us. How many times do we want to forgive somebody and we're going to forgive them, and that person's going, what? What are you forgiving me for? I didn't do anything. You know, and maybe that's a wrong opinion to have, but how many times do we want to forgive somebody and they actually did not do anything to us? Christ calls us to put our dukes down and instead seek love and understanding. Philippians 4:5 says, let your moderation, your gentleness be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. No one can argue someone to Christ. And only God is capable of changing hearts. There's a reason God tells us to pray for our enemies, not attempt to change them. And last, I'm going to close with this. Last is we make forgiveness a given. So many times forgiveness is kind of like that little thing that we kind of resort to. When all else fails, forgive. But we should make forgiveness or forgiven. As soon as it happens, our first consideration should be forgiveness. Leon Seltzer said, forgiveness is the single most potent antidote for the venomous desire for retributive justice, poisoning your system. I'll read that again and think about it. Forgiveness is the single most potent antidote for the venomous desire for retributive justice, poisoning your system. Forgiveness. Paul emphasized the importance of forgiveness in his letter to the Ephesians when he said, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ in God has forgiven you. One last little statement. C.S. Lewis said, to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because Christ has forgiven the inexcusable in you. And our lives How many times have we not forgiven the inexcusable in others, not even thinking about that Christ forgave the inexcusable in us? Not next week, in 2 weeks, I've got a lot more notes on speaking about forgiveness and our struggle as believers to go back in time and to forgive past hurts. We all do it. We have all got things in our past that we like, I want to forgive this person. How do I do it? So I'm going to speak just a little bit next in 2 weeks on forgiveness and going back and forgiving the past hurts.